can decide to have collective action, but then it also depends on the individuals. If the problem is being caused by people who are driving, and then they have to buy in as well. If smugglers see a way of making profit, you could win the collective action at the national level, but you can lose it at the international level. So it has to be favorable conditions at all these different levels. I like to think of collective action like an onion, and there's many different levels to where the collective action has to occur. And then the distribution of gains must be fairly equal, or else there must be adjustments that are made. Otherwise, some countries may not act because they think other countries get more than they will get. I mean, there is jealousy. In my family of 7, we had a lot of jealousy. In the family of 200 or so countries, there's a lot of jealousy as well. So the first problem I want to very briefly talk about is ozone shield depletion. Just give you a couple stylized facts. The ozone layer, which protects us against ultraviolet B radiation, is a layer from 10 miles to 25 miles up. If you compress the whole layer together, it's 3 millimeters thick. It's 1 part per million of the atmosphere. Without this layer, we wouldn't have life on the Earth as we know it today. Ozone's a funny word. You know, you think about ozone, and during the summertime, and you have a haze in a city, that's ozone too. Ozone is good when it's up in the stratosphere. It's bad when it's in the troposphere. Eventually, it goes from the troposphere up to the stratosphere. Some of it will, and replenish. So there is a replenishment process that occurs. But ozone, whether it's good or bad, depends on where it is. When it's up in the stratosphere, it's really good. It protects against extinction of species, disruption of the food chain, really the base of the food chain in terms of the oceans, protects us against skin cancers, impairment of immune systems, and cataracts. And as I say, there's no gainers from a depleted ozone layer. The problem was least spotted in a British Antarctica survey in 1985, where we saw that the ozone layer depleted by 40% from 1964 levels. Now, this is very ironic, because the U.S. had satellites up there looking at the ozone layer. They put these satellites up way before 1985 to do one thing, to monitor the ozone layer. So you have to ask yourself, why didn't NASA see that the ozone layer was depleted? Why did somebody with instruments at the South Pole have to look up to see that there was a hole in the ozone layer when we had much finer instruments out in outer space without the distortion of the atmosphere? And it's a really ironic story behind that. When NASA put these satellites up, they were afraid that the satellites might give them wrong information. So they programmed the satellites it was like a Dolby system, where if the sound went out of a certain range, it kicked it back into an acceptable range. So they put an acceptable range on the satellite, so that when the ozone depletion started to record what the true levels were, the device on the satellite kicked it back and made the reading what they thought the reading should be, not what it really was. I mean, really ironic, because the way they knew that was once this information came out, NASA was criticized. So NASA went back and looked at the data unfiltered. And what they found was that the ozone layer had depleted. They were getting this information. It was more than 40%, because they could see it better than we could from Antarctica. It's ironic that they would ever do anything like that, but they did. And that's why it took us at least 5 to 10 years longer to find out what was happening. We could have got at this problem quicker. There was an EPA report on what a 50% cutback in just U.S. use of chlorofluorocarbons, which are the ozone depleters, the main ozone depleter. Bromides also deplete ozone. And the benefit came back at $64 trillion by the year 2075 in reduced house costs. And the cost of using the substitutes, this is all from just U.S. point of view, was $20 to $40 billion. So this was a no-brainer, as we would say in America. The benefits were almost 100 to 1. Or was that 1,000 to 1? I don't know. Billions and trillions are always difficult for me. Maybe 1,000 to 1. It was clearly the benefits for the U.S. far outweighed the costs of the U.S. So then right away the U.S. became proactive. When the EPA study was done for global warming, it was the opposite way. The cost for the cutbacks that were being discussed were far greater than the benefits. That's why the U.S. has taken this attitude of doing nothing and being a hindrance for collective action. So the message got out. The U.S. shared its studies with other countries, and the major producers and consumers, which were at this point the U.S., Japan, the former Soviet Union, and the EU, even without the EU, just those three actors accounted for 46% of the emissions. With the EU put on, you had about 65% of the emissions. So just 4 actors could make such a difference. So you didn't need a lot of actors. There was a small number of players. That was good for collective actions. Plus, the companies that made the chlorofluorocarbons also discovered substitutes, which basically were, at first it was hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which had much less chlorine in it. It's chlorine, when it breaks apart, that causes the depletion. So it had only 15% of the chlorine, so it only caused 15% of the depletion. Then they came out with hydrofluorocarbons, which had no chlorine and caused no depletion. Again, just the hypocrisy of countries. Yes, the U.S. cut back on chlorofluorocarbons. Chlorofluorocarbons are a very bad global warmer. So the U.S. then argued to the world community, we should be able to get a credit for this and I'll be allowed to do more global warming because we're taking this very bad global warmer out of the system, the chlorofluorocarbons. Truth was, the substitutes were just as bad in terms of global warming. They just didn't deplete the ozone layer. And the U.S. knew that, which was quite hypocritical. So they replaced one global warmer with another global warmer, equally as efficient as a global warmer. But they did help the ozone layer, big time. So why didn't the corporations inhibit this action? Because they were going to make billions of dollars from the substitutes. So they were happy. So you had nobody inhibiting the collective action. So the collective action went through, and with the U.S. leadership. Here's just a very quick list of some of the treaties. The Vienna Convention first went through, and it said we should look at the problem. It didn't mandate any action. It was the Montreal Protocol, which is now very famous, that mandated a 50% cut. But then a couple years later, or a year later, actually, from the ratification, the London Amendment went through and cut a much greater number of CFCs and started going into other ozone depleters. And it even said that there'd be non-binding cuts on hydrochlorofluorocarbons, on the substitutes. Copenhagen Amendment comes through, and it increases the list. And it now has explicit cuts on the substitutes that still were depleters. And the story goes on until we have seen tremendous collective action. Now, the misunderstanding of the world community is, we found the blueprint. Montreal Protocol and the language and all that, that's the blueprint. If we use that language with respect to the Kyoto Protocol, we're going to get the same success. So I challenge you to do the following thing. Download the text of the Kyoto Protocol. Download the text of the Montreal Protocol. Pull them side to side. It's almost word for word. Why? Because they thought this was the blueprint. But it wasn't the blueprint because the underlying collective action aspects were completely different for the two problems. So you could use the same language, but you weren't going to necessarily get success. Global warming which occurs from a greenhouse effect as trapped gases in the Earth's atmosphere, heats the atmosphere. It absorbs the heat, captures the infrared radiation, and it raises the mean air temperature. The global warmers are carbon dioxide is one of the main ones, chlorofluorocarbons, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, methane, nitrous oxides, and there's other greenhouse gases. Even deforestation adds to the process because forests